He won the ODI World Cup with England 5 years ago and is now masterminding the Punjab Kings shot at a first IPL title.
A long way to go, and look, we're confident. We've been playing some decent cricket. But
Trevor Bayliss is one of cricket's sharpest minds, and he is concerned about the rapid expansion of franchise cricket.
I think the ICC have got a delicate situation or delicate decision to be made.
How to get Johnny Bairstow firing again, the domination of the Pacers this IPL, and much more. Trevor Bayliss answers all those questions today on WION World of Sport at these times.
Hello and welcome to WION live broadcast from London. I'm Oliver Regan and these are the headlines. Latest YouGov poll projects Sunak's Conservatives would win just 155 seats as compared to Labour's 403 seats in the UK Parliament. World Central Kitchen founder blames Israel for attacking charity's vehicle, which killed 7 aid workers in Gaza Strip, alleges Israeli airstrikes that hit aid convoy were not an unfortunate mistake. French President Macron changes 2-year stance on Russia, goes from not wanting to humiliate Russia to suggesting troops be sent to Ukraine. According to a new Wall Street Journal poll, Donald Trump leads President Joe Biden in 6 of the 7 swing states in the 2024 election, fueled by broad voter dissatisfaction with the national economy and doubts about Biden's health. The Russian Foreign Ministry gives a thumbs up to the booming oil trade with India, backs settlement of bilateral trade in local currencies, including the rupee. Arsenal beat relegation-threatened Luton Town 2-0 in the English Premier League. The victory sees the Gunners reclaim the top spot from Liverpool, who will host Sheffield United later today.
Ends the Premier League table. Erdegaard and a Hasioka own goal, all very straightforward.
In an interview, Rishi Sunak said he was undecided on the date of the next general election. The British Prime Minister's Conservative Party is set for a heavy defeat at the national election expected later this year if polls are to be believed. A seat prediction published on Wednesday showed the opposition Labour Party winning more than 400 seats. The YouGov model projected that Sunak's Conservatives would win just 155 seats and Labour would win 403 seats. Britain's Parliament has 650 seats. Polls have consistently given Labour a double-digit lead over the Conservatives, ahead of an election which Sunak has said he expects to call in the second half of the year.
Look, I said my working assumption is there'll be an election in the second half of the year, and I'll stick to
So
that.
no
But
June.
ultimately, look, we've got a long-standing tradition. It's the Prime Ministers that decide when we're going to call an election, and I haven't decided because I'm busy focusing on the things that matter to people, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. Making sure that we improve the economy, get people's pay packets rising, cutting their taxes, getting illegal migration down,
Lots of
improving
our
the
readers
NHS.
have written in.
That's the things that I'm focused on delivering for people.
Rishi Sunak's now heading for a worse result than John Major's 1997 total of 165 seats. The coming tidal wave projected by the YouGov model would sweep away several major Conservative figures. The most prominent casualty could be the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, who is currently fractionally behind the Liberal Democrats in his Godalming and Ash seat. Science Secretary Michelle Donnellan is also currently trailing the Liberal Democrats in her Melksham and Davies seat. And Michael Gove is just 1 point ahead in his Surrey Heath seat. Now, the recent weeks have seen rumours that Penny Mordaunt could issue a leadership challenge against Sunak. The Commons leader is 4 points behind Labour in her Portsmouth North seat. Cabinet colleague Welsh Secretary David T.C. Davies is also trailing Labour, and so are former leader Ian Duncan-Smith and the former leader of the House of Commons, Jacobs Rees-Mogg. Now, Sunak also defended his government's contentious bill to deport asylum seekers to Rwanda. He told the Sun newspaper's political editor Harry Cole that controlling illegal migration is more important than the UK's membership of the European Court. The United Nations Human Rights Committee urged Britain in March to abandon the bill, which could become law next month. Sunak's Conservative government wants to relocate thousands of asylum seekers who arrive in Britain on small inflatable boats each year to live in Rwanda. Legal challenges have so far prevented anyone being sent to the East African country.
If you come to our country illegally, you won't be able to stay, and we will be able to return you. Either to your home if it's safe, but if not, to a safe alternative, and that's where Rwanda comes in. Now, that's why I'm doing everything I can to get this bill through Parliament so that we can start sending people to Rwanda.
Well, for more on this, we're now joined by our correspondent, Julia Chapman from London. Julia, another week, another damaging poll for Rishi Sunak's Conservatives. Give us your assessment of this latest model from YouGov and the potential ramifications in this election year.
Well, it continues to look particularly difficult for the Conservative Party. Another poll predicting that they will be wiped out at the general election whenever that ends up being held. This prediction looking at each individual constituency in the country, giving a lot of granular detail into the areas where the Conservatives are facing particular difficulty and the names that you outlined that are at risk of losing their seats. Big names like the Chancellor, the country's finance minister, Jeremy Hunt. He would certainly be the most prominent, but also the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, looks likely to lose his seat on the current trajectory, according to this YouGov poll. And this was a poll that was an independent poll. It hadn't been commissioned by anyone, unlike a similar one carried out a few months ago. So everybody looking at this morning, particularly damning reading for the Conservative Party, heaping more pressure on Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to pull his party out of the doldrums and put it on a path to winning more seats. This is a particularly stark number that we're hearing from YouGov, setting the Tories up to win just 155 seats in Parliament. That would be a loss of 210 seats from what they have at the moment, putting Labour on a course to win 403 seats, a pretty sizable majority, not as many seats as they did win in that 1997 election. That was 418, but still a pretty significant victory if that is indeed where things go when it comes to having that general election expected later this year. Now, you've been speaking about the Rwanda policy. That is one area that Rishi Sunak is pinning his hopes on. That does look likely to go through Parliament in the coming weeks. But as you mentioned, there could be court challenges from a European court, which Rishi Sunak has suggested he would be willing to pull out of if it did jeopardise this policy of sending migrants to Rwanda. But ultimately, that's not the main issue that most British voters will be casting their ballots on when it comes to going to the polls later in the year. The economy is by far the most significant concern for most people, according to the polls. The healthcare service as well, which is facing a number of different challenges. Rishi Sunak says that he is on track to improve the economy, despite the fact that the most recent figures confirmed that the UK was in a recession towards the end of last year. The economic figures are looking better now. He says that people need to stick with him in order to help his plan see fruition, promising to improve the livelihoods of the British people, to cut taxes as well. So he wants to be positioning himself as someone who can lead the country going forward. But this poll suggests that he will not be the one leading the country after the next election.
Absolutely. Tough job ahead, I think, for Rishi Sunak. Julia Chapman, many thanks for your insight there. Now, US President Joe Biden will speak with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the phone. This comes 3 days after Israel launched an attack in which 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers were killed in Gaza. The aid workers were killed when their convoy was hit shortly after they were overseeing the unloading of 100 tons of food brought to Gaza by sea. World leaders have reacted strongly, including the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. The White House has described Biden as outraged and heartbroken by the attack. However, the President has made no fundamental change in the United States' steadfast support for Israel in its conflict in Gaza.
And so we are going to continue to mourn with them, with Chef Jose Andres and obviously the families. I'm just not going to, he's going to speak for himself. We are very clear about where we stand. I think the President's statement was incredibly powerful, impactful, and really truly lays out how he feels about the current situation.
Meanwhile, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to face pressure at home and abroad over the war in Gaza, Israel's War Cabinet member Benny Gantz has now called for national elections in September. Gantz said he believed an agreed election date would allow Israeli society to renew its contract with its leadership. Thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets in recent days demanding new elections. Many have criticised Netanyahu and expressed anger at his government's handling of the 134 Israeli hostages still held in Gaza 6 months into the war. Well, we're now joined by our correspondent Jody Cohen from Tel Aviv. And Jody, President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu are expected to speak on the phone on Thursday. What do you think is likely to be the conversation?
Hi, Oliver. So this call comes after President Biden expressed outrage about the deaths of the aid workers. The IDF called it an unintentional grave mistake. But Defense Secretary Austin said that the tragedy reinforces US concern about the potential Israeli ground operation in Rafah. So they're likely to be discussing the investigation of this incident and the Rafah plans. It's also likely that Netanyahu will thank President Biden for his continued support throughout this war, including improving the sale of military equipment to Israel this week, despite their differences in policy. Now, it's thought that Biden and Netanyahu agree that Israel needs to defeat the last Hamas battalions in Rafah, but disagree on how to do that without harming civilians. Israel believes that the most effective way is to evacuate civilians to central Gaza, where shelter and aid would be provided, and that this military pressure on Hamas is also the best way to bring Hamas to a deal to release the 134 Israeli hostages who are being held captive in Gaza. Now, the US reportedly wants civilians to remain in Rafah and for Israel to carry out raids against Hamas like in the West Bank. And an Israeli delegation is expected to head to Washington next week for further talks on this.
Well, let's turn to the situation in Israel. Of course, the War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz, we've heard what he's had to say, and he was, of course, seen as a chief rival to Netanyahu before he joined the coalition after the October attack. But now he's called for an election in September. Do you think that's likely to happen?
It's hard to say. I mean, when Gantz called for the election in September, he cited the need to maintain unity and also to renew trust in the government. Head of the opposition, Yair Lapid, and the anti-government protesters as well. They're saying that September is not soon enough, that they want elections now. But September is well before the current coalition's term ends. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has suggested that it's not the time to be engaged in politics and disunity. He said that the government would remain until the war goals have been achieved. And he said that an election would lead to paralysis in the war and the hostage negotiations. Now, some friends and family of the hostage who I've spoken to, they disagree, but some agree and say that it's not the time for elections now. And they've actually called on protesters, for example, not to use the posters of their children in their protests. That's because they believe that combining anti-government protests with rallies for the hostages would embolden Hamas in the hostage release talks. So right now it's not thought that an election is likely, but September is still a long way away.
Absolutely, anything can change at any moment. Many thanks to our correspondent there, Jodie Cohen, joining us live from Tel Aviv. UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps has warned NATO countries who are not spending 2% of their GDP on defence that are playing Russian roulette with the West's future. NATO estimates show that only 11 members are spending at that target level. Now, that figure is expected to rise to 18% this year, with Paris and Berlin recently announcing that they will hit the target in 2024. However, others in the 32-nation alliance have not done so. In an article for The Telegraph, Shapps said, "Today we must give urgent thought once again to the alliance's future. We have moved from a post-war to a pre-war world." Across NATO, a concern and sense of urgency about the development of defence budgets has built up over the last 2 decades. Since the end of the Cold War in 1990, overall defence spending among NATO members has been cut significantly and persistently. Serious concerns have arisen about the alliance's military readiness and its ability to keep its security guarantee to its member states. The decision to embrace the 2% metric highlighted these concerns, which have culminated with the Ukraine crisis. The US Armed Forces form the core of the military power of the alliance. Not all US defence spending is dedicated to security in Europe, NATO's original remit. As per Carnegie Europe, it's clear that NATO allies have fallen further behind on the issue of financial burden sharing in the alliance.
Two guys are on both sides. The two guys will go on both sides of head.
Over 2 years of the Ukraine conflict, the French president has gone from not wanting to humiliate Russia to suggesting troops now be sent into Ukraine. Macron's attitude towards Moscow has changed, switching from the side of foreign policy dove to that of the hawk. By siding with the hawks, he's seeking to make up for the lost goodwill at the start of the conflict among countries in Central Europe, Scandinavia and the Baltic states. Or are the reasons multifold? At a February conference in Paris, the French president said a deployment of Western troops to fight Russia on the ground in Ukraine should not be ruled out. The suggestion angered Russian President Vladimir Putin and was dismissed by Ukraine's main backers. While speaking in Prague on March the 5th, Macron declared that Europeans can't be cowards when countering Moscow. Analysts have highlighted multiple reasons behind Macron's shifting posture. First, Ukraine's battlefield woes. Russia is gaining momentum in its assault on Ukraine amid stalled Western aid, making the coming months critical to the direction of conflict. In a worst-case scenario, parts of Kyiv's front line could be at risk of collapse. Hitting out, Russian Deputy FM said, "These statements show a readiness to follow the path of escalation when the West itself is suffering a strategic defeat on the ground." Alexander Grushko added, "Such claims, no matter what foreign or domestic political goals they pursue, are unacceptable for responsible politicians." He flagged that already heated military and political situation in Europe. Another reason for Macron's changed stance towards Russia is probably that Trump's very possible second presidency is casting its shadow. Some analysts say Macron wants to advance his vision for Europe's strategic autonomy and show Europe's ability to support Kyiv without counting on the US. Russia has worked intensively in recent years to drive France out of Africa's Sahel region and is also playing a role. Moscow has seemingly used anti-French campaigns to turn the mood of the population against the former colonial power. Russia has made offers to authoritarian African regimes to ensure their security and thus make France's presence dispensable. Last but not least, European elections are approaching. The hard right of Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella look set to trounce the Macronites. Is Macron using Ukraine to create a fault line between his side and the opposition? Analysts say the French president may be looking to set a contrast between his remarks and Le Pen's complicity with Moscow in the past. Critics say Macron could have led the European response to the crisis in terms of military assistance. Instead, they say the mismatch between some of Macron's words and his actions has weakened his standing amongst his European allies. It's not clear that it's raised his standing